The story began in the quiet cul-de-sac of Cypress Ridge, a neighborhood that marketed itself as peaceful, orderly, and impeccably maintained. But beneath the manicured lawns and freshly painted fences lived an unspoken tension, an invisible pressure that grew stronger every time the HOA flexed its authority. For years, residents had learned to tiptoe around the rules, not because they believed in them, but because they feared the person who enforced them. That person was Margaret Hollings, the woman the neighborhood had nicknamed Poolside Karen. She had earned the title through a series of petty crackdowns and unnecessary confrontations that turned simple neighborhood interactions into dramatic productions. I had moved into Cypress Ridge a year earlier, hopeful for a fresh start after leaving a crowded apartment complex. My new home had a backyard pool, a rare feature in a neighborhood where most homeowners had to rely on the community pool. It was a modest pool, not large or luxurious, but big enough to enjoy quiet swims after long workdays. In a place like Cypress Ridge, where personal space was scarce and HOA rules were abundant, having my own pool felt like a small freedom. But freedom was something Margaret couldn't stand. From the first week I moved in, she appeared at the edge of my property, with her ever-present clipboard, observing every minor detail. She monitored trash cans, measured grass length with her gaze, and frowned at anything she considered even slightly non-compliant. And although none of her visits resulted in formal violations, it was clear she was searching for a reason to assert control. For a while, I brushed it off. Many HOAs had overly invested board members, and Margaret seemed like the type who needed a hobby. But as the months passed, it became obvious she didn't want a hobby, she wanted power. The breaking point came at the beginning of summer, just as the weather warmed and families started spending afternoons outside. The community pool had been closed for maintenance, leaving residents frustrated and restless. The closure was supposed to last a week, but delays stretched it to 3. Parents with children complained. Retirees who swam daily were irritated. And through it all, Margaret remained resolute, citing policies and safety concerns to justify the extended closure. That's when she turned her sights on me. My backyard pool, once ignored by her, became her new obsession. She watched it from a distance, pacing along the sidewalk as if waiting for an excuse to intervene. It wasn't until I hosted a small afternoon swim for my niece's 3 children under 10 that she decided she'd found her opportunity. The rumors began before the afternoon even ended. Neighbors whispered that I was charging people for access to my pool. Others said I was operating an unofficial community facility. A few claimed they saw lines of strangers coming in and out of my backyard. All of it was fabricated, but in a neighborhood ruled by gossip and HOA politics, rumors were as powerful as written rules. When I learned what was being said, I assumed it would blow over. But Margaret wasn't interested in letting anything go. She saw the closed community pool as a crisis and saw me as the solution. Not a willing one, but one she intended to force into compliance. The next morning, she arrived on my doorstep with her clipboard and an air of forced civility. She made it clear, through her tone and posture, that she believed my backyard pool should be open to the neighborhood on a temporary basis. She framed it as a community service, a gesture of goodwill, an opportunity to help my neighbors during the maintenance closure. But hidden beneath her carefully constructed phrasing was a demand. She expected access, both for herself and the residents she oversaw. Her visit left me unsettled. It was one thing to monitor lawns and mailboxes, but forcing private homeowners to open their personal property to the public was an entirely different matter. I spent the rest of the day replaying the interaction in my mind, trying to rationalize her motives. Perhaps the HOA was under pressure. Perhaps residents were complaining too much, or perhaps Margaret simply saw an opportunity to exert control in a situation that wasn't hers to influence. But regardless of her reasoning, my answer was no. I didn't make a scene or confront her publicly. I simply maintained the boundary that my property was private and not subject to HOA authority. I thought the matter was resolved. I was wrong. Later that week, as the midday sun cast shimmering reflections across the surface of my backyard pool, a sudden noise broke the calm. I heard footsteps approaching rapidly, followed by the unmistakable sound of a phone being held up, recording. When I looked out the window, there she was, Margaret, standing at the edge of my gate, surveying my backyard as though conducting an inspection. Her face was a mixture of frustration and triumph, as if she had discovered evidence of wrongdoing. It became clear that she wasn't simply enforcing rules anymore, she was trying to build a case. Over the next few days, she increased her patrols. She took photos of my pool equipment, scribbled notes about water levels, and even spoke to neighbors about concerning activity. It was evident she believed she had found a violation, or would eventually find one if she looked hard enough. The tension in the neighborhood grew, and whispers started spreading about how I was refusing to cooperate with the HOA. And then came the incident that escalated everything. It was a Saturday afternoon when 3 neighborhood kids wandered into my yard through the side gate, claiming that the lady from the HOA told them the pool was open for community use. Their arrival stunned me. Not only had Margaret overstepped, but she had encouraged minors to enter private property without permission. The situation could have turned dangerous quickly, and the liability alone was unthinkable. I guided the kids home and immediately confronted the HOA in writing. The action was necessary, justified, and cautious, but it also infuriated Margaret. The next morning, I woke to the sound of sirens. Red and blue lights flickered outside my home as police cruisers parked along the curb. Officers stepped out with the confident stride of individuals responding to a serious complaint. And standing near them, arms crossed, expression triumphant, was Margaret. She had called the cops. And in that moment, I knew the confrontation had reached a level from which there was no turning back. The moment the police car rolled to a stop in front of my house, the quiet suburb transformed into a stage for Margaret's greatest performance yet. The neighbors emerged from behind curtains and porch railings, watching with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. In a place like Cypress Ridge, police activity was rare, and the sight of multiple officers responding to a single home was enough to stir excitement and fear in equal measure. The air felt thick, as though the entire cul-de-sac was holding its breath. I stepped onto my porch with a cautious sense of dread, unsure of what accusations Margaret had made this time. She stood proudly near the officers, acting as though she were their unofficial captain, guiding them toward what she claimed was a pressing neighborhood emergency. The setting felt surreal. My private backyard pool had somehow escalated into a matter she believed required law enforcement intervention. The officers conducted their assessment with professionalism, surveying the property and taking in the details Margaret insisted were incriminating. She pointed at the gate, at the pool, at the security cameras mounted near the roofline. Her gestures were dramatic, animated by an unwavering confidence that her claims would be validated. But as the officers examined the area, their expressions remained neutral, giving no indication of agreement or concern. It soon became clear that Margaret had drastically overplayed her hand. She had framed the situation as an ongoing threat to the community, claiming unauthorized gatherings, unsafe conditions, and reckless endangerment. But there was no evidence of any of it. The officers found a quiet backyard, locked gates, well-maintained pool equipment, and no indication of criminal activity. Everything she had described was either exaggerated or entirely fabricated. Yet despite the lack of evidence, her insistence persisted. The officers' patience began to erode. Eventually, after a long and painfully transparent attempt on Margaret's part to escalate the situation, the officers concluded their visit with a written record and no further action. They approached her with clear disappointment, delivering what appeared to be a firm explanation that her claims were unfounded. Their demeanor suggested this wasn't the first time they had encountered a resident weaponizing emergency services for personal grievances. When they finally left, the neighborhood slowly began to retreat into their homes. The flashing lights disappeared down the street, and the cul-de-sac returned to an eerie calm. But although the police were gone, the damage was far from over. Margaret, humiliated by being dismissed in front of half the neighborhood, had a storm brewing behind her tight smile. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, but there was an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of Cypress Ridge. Neighbors who once waved politely now hesitated. Others lingered nearby, whispering, letting rumors form and spread with each retelling. Some saw Margaret's extreme reaction as overreach. Others wondered if there was more to the story than what they had seen. And then there were those who feared getting involved at all, unwilling to challenge the HOA's most powerful figure. For the first time since moving in, I felt the weight of true isolation within my own neighborhood. Later that evening, I noticed a folded flyer tucked under my door. It bore the HOA's logo at the top and contained a neatly printed announcement. The message referred vaguely to recent disruptions, concerns about resident cooperation, and the importance of community compliance during facility maintenance. It ended with a reminder that all homeowners were expected to uphold neighborhood standards and contribute positively to the community. Although the flyer didn't name me directly, the intent was obvious. Margaret was attempting to sway public perception, preparing the neighborhood for whatever she intended to do next. It was a calculated move, one that hinged on subtle insinuation rather than overt blame. In HOA politics, perception was everything, and Margaret had mastered the art of crafting narratives that served her interests. She understood that if she couldn't control the situation with enforcement, she could manipulate it through influence. Over the next few days, I became the subject of quiet speculation. Neighbors walked slower past my home. Some avoided eye contact entirely. The incident had shifted the delicate balance of the neighborhood, creating invisible walls between households. Margaret, sensing the growing tension, took advantage of the atmosphere. She began circulating revised guidelines for backyard water features, as she called them, and introduced new HOA interpretations that conveniently aligned with her objectives. She hosted informal gatherings on her porch, drawing in residents who felt uneasy about the situation. There, surrounded by her loyal supporters, she shaped the narrative in ways that suited her goals. She spoke of safety hazards, community unity, and responsible stewardship. But beneath her carefully crafted messaging was a clear and hostile undertone. She wanted control, absolute, unquestionable control over anything she believed fell under her jurisdiction. And she intended to make an example out of me. The turning point came when I received an official notice from the HOA demanding that I submit my pool for an inspection. The notice claimed it was necessary to verify compliance with community standards and neighborhood safety guidelines. But the timing made the intent unmistakable. It wasn't about safety, it was about retaliation. What unsettled me most wasn't the demand itself, but the list of concerns attached to it. Each one echoed the accusations Margaret had presented to the police, all of which had already been disproven. Yet here they were, repackaged as formal points of scrutiny, justified under the guise of neighborhood welfare. The notice gave me 72 hours to respond. As the deadline approached, I realized ignoring the HOA wasn't an option. Compliance would be seen as submission, while refusal would be framed as defiance. Every choice seemed to play directly into Margaret's hands, as though she had crafted the situation to force me into conflict. I considered involving legal counsel, documenting the harassment, or filing formal complaints of my own. But before I could take action, another incident erupted, an incident that pushed the neighborhood into full-blown chaos. One night, as I checked my backyard cameras, I saw motion. The screen flickered, revealing a figure standing near my side gate. The person was examining the lock, testing it subtly, as though attempting to determine whether it could be opened. The figure lingered for a moment before walking away, disappearing into the shadows between the houses. The next morning, word spread quickly. Someone had been seen wandering the neighborhood, checking doors, gates, and backyards. The residents speculated wildly. Some believed it was a trespasser. Others whispered about disgruntled teenagers, but a few suspected it was connected to the pool dispute, a suspicion that only deepened tensions. And in the midst of the growing panic, Margaret called an emergency HOA meeting. The neighborhood braced itself, because everyone knew that whenever Margaret scheduled an emergency meeting, chaos was sure followed the emergency. HOA meeting was announced with the same urgency one might expect for a natural disaster. The notice appeared in every resident's mailbox, an inbox, before sunrise, stressing that attendance was mandatory for neighborhood clarity and safety concerns. The language was heavy, ominous, and unmistakably influenced by Margaret. It framed the situation as a crisis that required swift action, though no one seemed entirely certain what the crisis actually was. By evening, residents shuffled toward the community center with wary expressions and hushed murmurs. The building, typically used for weekend craft fairs and small holiday gatherings, felt unusually charged. Folding chairs were arranged in rigid rows facing a long table where the HOA board sat. At the center of it, like a queen presiding over her court, sat Margaret. Her clipboard rested before her like a badge of authority, and her posture radiated self-assurance. She didn't just expect compliance, she expected validation. As residents settled in, the atmosphere grew tighter, as though the very walls sensed the tension brewing. The meeting began with a formality that barely concealed the undercurrent of drama beneath it. Reports were read, updates were presented, and mundane matters were addressed. But everyone knew these were merely the prelude to the real reason they had been summoned. The moment the conversation shifted to recent neighborhood disturbances, all eyes turned toward Margaret. She wasted no time seizing control of the room. She presented her version of events surrounding the pool dispute with practiced precision. According to her, the neighborhood was facing a threat of escalating noncompliance, property misuse, and unauthorized activity. She implied these issues were creating safety risks and setting dangerous precedents for the community. Her narrative cast herself as a vigilant protector of neighborhood standards and painted anyone who resisted HOA authority as negligent. She referenced the police incident, framing it as a necessary precaution rather than a reckless exaggeration. She spoke of the late-night trespasser sighting with grave seriousness, weaving it in her storyline as evidence of disorder spreading through the community. Though she never mentioned my name directly, the implication was woven into every sentence she delivered. The crowd shifted in their seats, absorbing her every word. Some nodded along with her claims, unsure but willing to trust the HOA's long-standing figurehead. Others seemed uneasy, sensing exaggeration but reluctant to publicly challenge her. But the turning point came when she introduced a new proposal, a sweeping policy that would give the HOA expanded oversight over private recreational structures. It was described as a preventive measure designed to protect residents, but the intention was unmistakable. The proposal would grant the HOA authority to inspect private pools, set usage limitations, and enforce penalties for non-compliance. It was a direct attempt to control something that had always been outside their jurisdiction. The room's energy shifted sharply. Some residents looked stunned. Others whispered, realizing the implication. Granting the HOA that level of power would mean no one's backyard space would truly be private anymore. It would set a precedent that allowed excessive interference in personal property under the guise of community welfare. The board members exchanged hesitant glances. Even those who typically supported Margaret seemed uncertain. The proposal felt intrusive, overreaching, and driven more by personal vendetta than genuine concern. Despite the tension, Margaret continued pressing her agenda with unwavering determination. She highlighted the trespasser incident as evidence of neighborhood vulnerability. She referenced the pool closure frustrations, subtly suggesting that private pools had become points of community contention. She described the HOA's role as essential in maintaining order, structure, and predictability. But then, something unexpected happened. A resident raised a concern not through confrontation but through careful observation. The resident pointed out that the trespasser incident appeared unrelated to any pool dispute, as no evidence tied the late-night figure to any specific home. Another resident expressed discomfort with allowing the HOA access to private yard. A third questioned why police resources had been involved in a matter that seemed exaggerated. Slowly, the room began to shift. The once passive audience was engaging, analyzing, and questioning. Margaret sensed the shift immediately. Her posture stiffened, and she began leaning harder into fear-based reasoning. She spoke of hypothetical liabilities, potential lawsuits, and catastrophic scenarios that could arise without strict HOA oversight. She attempted to regain control by painting her proposals as the only safeguard against chaos. But the more she pressed, the more resistance emerged. Residents who once remained silent began voicing concerns about personal boundaries, overreach, and misuse of authority. Longtime homeowners, who had seen the HOA's influence grow year after year, were suddenly reconsidering how much power they had allowed Margaret to accumulate. They questioned past decisions, inconsistencies, and policies that had benefited only a select few. For the first time in years, her authority was being challenged in a public, unified way. The board, sensing the brewing discontent, hesitated to vote on the proposal. They called for additional review, stating that any policy affecting personal property required further discussion. Their tone was cautious, measured, and noticeably lacking the usual rubber-stamp support they gave Margaret's initiatives. The meeting dragged into the night, filled with tension, speculation, and shifting alliances. Some residents left early, expressing frustration. Others stayed, wanting to witness the unfolding spectacle. As the debate continued, it became clear that many homeowners had grown weary of feeling monitored, judged, and controlled. Yet Margaret refused to concede. She insisted the proposal was essential, framing any hesitation as a lapse in community responsibility. But every attempt she made to regain dominance only highlighted how desperately she needed control and how threatened she felt by the possibility of losing it. Eventually, the board made an announcement. The vote would be postponed until further notice. They would review the language, gather feedback, and ensure fairness before making any decisions. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As people exited the meeting, the neighborhood felt transformed. Conversations emerged in murmurs, reflecting newfound doubt about Margaret's intentions. Some residents walked past me with nods of quiet support, while others avoided eye contact, still attempting to process the dramatic evening. But Margaret was not finished. As the room emptied, she remained seated at the board table, her face tight with anger. She realized her influence had been weakened, her authority undermined. Her eyes, filled with simmering resentment, followed me as I left the building. It was clear she wasn't ready to let the situation go. And as the night settled over Cypress Ridge, a quiet certainty took hold. The conflict had entered a new phase. Whatever came next would be far more calculated in the days that followed the explosive HOA meeting. Cypress Ridge felt heavier, as if the very air had thickened with suspicion and unease. The neighbors no longer moved with the casual comfort of a tight-knit community. Instead, they behaved like people living on the edge of something fragile, something that could crack open with one more wrong step. Every conversation carried undertones. Every glance lasted a second too long. And at the center of the tension stood Margaret, simmering with a quiet, calculated fury. Her failed proposal had wounded her pride, but humiliation alone wasn't enough to break her. In fact, It seemed to ignite something sharper, something colder. She had built her identity on being the unwavering authority of Cypress Ridge. Losing control, even slightly, threatened the image she had spent years crafting, and she would not allow that image to crumble. The first signs of her retaliation began with subtle changes designed to appear administrative rather than personal. Notices started appearing in mailboxes throughout the neighborhood. These notices cited new reminders of long-standing regulations, though many of the rules she referenced were so obscure that most residents had never heard of them. Lawn ornaments were restricted, holiday decorations were limited, even parking configurations were suddenly scrutinized with a magnifying glass. Though the notices went out to everyone, the true target was obvious. She wanted to drown the neighborhood in frustration, then steer the blame toward the recent disruptions she had vaguely referenced in the meeting. If she couldn't win the argument through authority, she would win it through agitation and let the neighborhood's discomfort do the rest. But her broader campaign wasn't the only front she opened. I became the focus of her most personal attempts to reassert dominance. It began with daily inspection. She walked past my home at the same times every day, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning each inch of my property as if searching for faults invisible to anyone else. She documented everything: the position of my trash bins, the shape of my hedges, the angle of my porch lights. She never said a word, but the message was clear. She intended to find something, anything that could be used against me. After several days, a series of violation notices arrived. They were vague, citing aesthetic concerns and potential hazards, though none of them identified real issues. Each one felt like another step in a planned escalation, and each one strengthened my resolve to document everything in return. But retaliation wasn't her only goal. She wanted to reshape perception. She began approaching neighbors individually, speaking to them with hushed worry. Though I couldn't hear the words, the pattern was unmistakable. She leaned in close, using the same performative posture she had adopted during the police incident. Her expression conveyed the weight of fabricated responsibility, the burden of someone trying to protect the community. Whatever story she told, it was crafted to isolate me further. And for some, it worked. A handful of neighbors altered their behavior. People who once waved now avoided eye contact. One man quietly redirected his morning walks to avoid passing my house. A mother who used to let her children ride bikes along the street now kept them closer. It was never direct or confrontational, just small, deliberate shifts that signaled uncertainty. But not everyone fell in line. There were residents who had silently questioned the HOA for years, people who had grown weary of the constant oversight. Margaret's extreme behavior had made them reconsider their tolerance for her authority. A few of them walked past my house with subtle nods of reassurance. Others lingered a moment too long, as though debating whether to approach and offer support. Still, the neighborhood had undeniably divided. Some trusted Margaret. Others distrusted her, and the rest simply wanted the conflict to disappear so life could return to normal. Meanwhile, the board remained conspicuously quiet. They were reviewing the proposed policy changes, but they offered no clarity, no reassurance, no statement of neutrality. Their silence felt strategic, a way to let the conflict play out naturally, while they quietly assessed which way public opinion was leaning. It was an uncomfortable limbo, one that gave Margaret room to operate, unchecked. As days turned into a week, the atmosphere became increasingly unsettled. Then, one morning, a new incident jolted the neighborhood. A bright orange notice was posted on the community bulletin board near the park. In large, bold letters, it announced the proposal of a new special compliance committee. This committee would be responsible for monitoring potential violations, conducting property assessments, and overseeing neighborhood safety. Though framed as a neutral administrative measure, the structure clearly placed authority directly under Margaret's guidance. Residents gathered around the notice, reading it with alarm. It suggested that regular homeowners, ordinary neighbors, could be recruited to surveil others. The idea of turning residents into informants created a chilling vision of a hyper-policed community. Whispers erupted. Some expressed fear, others expressed anger. And for the first time, resentment toward Margaret became vocal rather than hushed. But the true tipping point occurred that evening. Just after dusk, the same shadowy figure who had previously been caught on cameras reappeared. This time, several homes recorded the person wandering along property lines, peering into side yards, and inspecting back gates. Panic spread quickly, and residents flooded the community forum demanding answers. Margaret seized the moment with the kind of speed that suggested she had been waiting for it. She posted a long message implying that the trespasser was a direct result of recent disruptions to the community's trust and structure. Though she did not name me, her references made the implication unmistakable. She framed the whole situation as evidence that stricter regulations and greater oversight were necessary to preserve the safety of Cypress Ridge, but this time the tactic backfired. Residents began drawing connections Margaret didn't intend. The timing of the trespasser sightings seemed suspicious. The person never caused harm, never attempted entry, never committed a crime. They simply inspected gates and walked away. Some began to quietly question whether the sightings were a coincidence at all. Others wondered whether the panic was being exaggerated or even orchestrated to further the HOA's agenda. Doubt spread rapidly. Margaret sensed her grip slipping and took to the community board with urgent posts. But instead of aligning with her, the neighborhood began to splinter even further. Arguments broke out online. One group demanded more transparency from the HOA. Another pushed for restrictions on the board's authority. Tension bubbled into frustration, and frustration spilled into open conflict. As the neighborhood fractured more visibly than ever before, the board announced a second emergency meeting, this time to address growing unrest and the future of HOA leadership. For the first time, people openly questioned whether it was time for Margaret to step down. And as Cypress Ridge prepared for yet another battle, one thing became clear. The ending was approaching, and it would expose more than anyone expected. The announcement of the second emergency HOA meeting rippled through Cypress Ridge like a shockwave. This time the tone was different. There was no sense of order, no calm professionalism, no illusion of routine. Instead, residents moved with the anxious urgency of people expecting a storm. The conflict had reached a boiling point, and everyone knew something irreversible was about to unfold. As evening fell, the community center filled faster than anyone had anticipated. People packed the rows, lined the walls, and clustered near the entrance. The hum of tense conversation echoed through the room, thick with frustration, suspicion, and quiet determination. Every resident had felt the effects of the escalating drama, whether through notices taped to their doors, tense exchanges with neighbors, or the disorienting unease of seeing a trespasser wander the streets at night. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about control, power, and the breaking point of a community pushed too far. Margaret arrived last, walking into the room with her usual posture of authority. But this time, her confidence didn't carry the same weight. There was something strained behind her expression, something that hinted at the pressure she was under. And though she took her place at the center of the board table, the reaction from the room was far from reverent. A wave of quiet disapproval met her presence, subtle but impossible to miss. The meeting began with procedural formalities, though no one pretended to care about them. The board attempted to set a structured tone, but the room simmered with too much emotion for structure to hold. When the conversation shifted to recent events, the tension tightened like a rope. For days, the neighborhood had been divided between those who feared the trespasser and those who questioned the legitimacy of the threat. Some believed the HOA's warnings were exaggerated, others suspected something deeper. And tonight, all those suspicions were about to collide. The board began presenting the timeline of neighborhood incidents, outlining everything from the initial pool dispute to the police call, the proposed policies, and the multiple sightings of the backyard trespasser. As they did, residents murmured among themselves, reacting to each detail with visible frustration. The more the board spoke, the clearer it became that no consensus existed. But then something unexpected happened, something that shifted the entire tone of the meeting. A board member presented a security analysis. Several homes had submitted footage of the trespasser from different angles and nights. After reviewing the videos collectively, the timestamps, the height, the clothing, and the behavior patterns, the board determined that the trespasser was not a stranger, a criminal, or a random neighborhood wanderer. It was someone who lived in Cypress Ridge. A ripple of shock tore through the room. Dozens of faces turned toward one another in disbelief, searching for answers in the silent chaos. But the board continued, revealing that the figure had been traced to a specific residential block, the block closest to Margaret's home. The implication hit the room like a clap of thunder. Suspicion sharpened instantly. Margaret sat stiffly, her expression frozen into something unreadable. The board, clearly uncomfortable, announced that they required further review before naming any individual. But even without names, the damage was done. The idea that the trespasser could be connected to the HOA leadership was enough to ignite the room. Residents who had remained quietly neutral found their frustration erupting into anger. Those who had already doubted the HOA's intentions now had a reason to voice their concerns openly. Questions became louder, more pointed. Why had the trespasser only appeared after the dispute began? Why had the HOA pushed so aggressively for new oversight? Why had the fear been magnified without evidence? The room was unraveling quickly, and the board scrambled to regain control. But the situation had gone too far. What finally broke the tension was the introduction of new evidence submitted privately by a resident who had grown suspicious of the entire situation. This resident had placed cameras not only in their yard but facing a small walkway behind the community center. In the footage, the trespasser could be seen removing a hoodie, revealing not a stranger's face, but the face of someone unmistakably tied to Margaret's inner circle. The board fell silent. The room erupted. Whispers surged through the air like wildfire, carrying accusations, questions, and disbelief. And though no official conclusion was announced, the truth was no longer something anyone could deny. The trespasser had not been an outsider threatening the neighborhood. They had been part of Margaret's orbit, someone likely assisting her in manufacturing a crisis that she could use to justify expanded authority. Everything connected. The exaggerated warnings, the sudden push for stricter regulations, the insistence that the neighborhood was in danger, the attempts to create panic and manipulate perception. The entire crisis had been rooted not in safety but in control. The board called for order, but the community was already emotionally unmoored. The meeting fractured into heated conversation. People demanded accountability, transparency, and consequences. Others expressed outrage at being manipulated and pressured. Even those who once supported Margaret now questioned how far she was willing to go. Eventually, the board announced a temporary suspension of all proposed policies, including Margaret's infamous pool oversight rule and the creation of the Special Compliance Committee. They declared an internal investigation into HOA leadership and stated that decisions would be announced publicly once completed. Margaret's face remained composed, but beneath her rigid stillness was a storm of humiliation and panic. Her authority, once so absolute, was crumbling in front of the entire neighborhood. The room no longer saw her as the vigilant protector of community standards, but as the architect of a crisis that had divided neighbors and weaponized fear. It was the end of her reign. In the days that followed, the board released a formal statement announcing that Margaret had voluntarily stepped down from her position as HOA president. Though framed politely, the reality was clear: she had been removed. The board cited leadership concerns, procedural violations, and misuse of HOA influence. The trespasser incident remained under investigation, but everyone in Cypress Ridge understood the implication without needing official confirmation. And just like that, the neighborhood began to heal. Residents reopened conversations. Families resumed morning routines. The fear and uncertainty that once hung over the cul-de-sac slowly dissolved. The pool became a symbol of regained normalcy rather than conflict. Neighbors who had remained distant began waving again, offering small gestures of reconciliation. The community had weathered a storm that nearly fractured it. And in the end, they emerged altered but stronger. As for me, the ordeal became a reminder of how quickly personal boundaries can be threatened when someone abuses authority. But it also revealed the strength of collective resistance, the power of neighbors who refused to be divided, manipulated, or intimidated. Cypress Ridge was no longer Margaret's kingdom. It was a community again. And the pool that began it all returned to what it had always been: a private space, a peaceful escape, and a reminder that sometimes the only way to stand against a Karen is simply to refuse to let her win.